Okay, I think we're ready. Okay, so let's what we're going to be looking at today is how we basically get a fix on the Gospel of Matthew. So we're at the midpoint in the semester, so we're starting with the first 6 weeks has been looking at general stuff about the Gospels, and the last 6 weeks will be on Matthew's Gospel in particular. So we're going to start by looking at issues which traditionally we talk about: the date, the place of composition, authorship, that sort of thing. So we're going to be looking at the Matthew in context, putting Matthew in his place, if you like, talking about issues of date and provenance and authorship and so on. And the beautiful, very fine, perfect, very good condition gold coin there is a coin from the Emperor Trajan. Okay, and we'll come to the significance of the Roman imperial present shortly. So I guess I'm flagging up front. I would tend to date. I think Matthew probably comes from the period of Trajan rather than the period of Domitian. But let's have a look and see. So the big picture is, because obviously Matthew's going to be dated somewhere in our 300-year window, from the Maccabees to Bar Kokhba. Okay, I mean that's the large historical window we're dealing with, and it's the Second Temple period down as far as the final Jewish revolt with Bar Kokhba. But it more particularly, of course, it's going to be in the latter part of that 300 years, and it's going to be somewhere between the Jewish rebellion, which leads to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, and the Bar Kokhba rebellion. There's no likelihood that Matthew is going to be later. It can't be later than Bar Kokhba. And there's nobody, I think, arguing that. There are people who argue that Matthew is earlier than the Jewish rebellion, okay? But then you've really got to cram a whole lot of historical developments and literary developments within the first 30 years after Easter, and that seems unlikely. So we're basically dealing with the last quarter of the first century or the first quarter of the second century. So 100 AD plus or minus 25 years is the kind of really the window we're looking at. Matthew's going to come somewhere in that 50-year period, and it's probably more like 100 CE plus or minus 15 years is probably realistically. Now, how important is 85 versus 115? Okay, whose theological sheep stations are threatened if we go for 115 rather than 85? Okay, why does a change of a couple of years, 10, 15 years, get the horses nervous? Okay, there's an underlying preference in Christian biblical studies, of course, to get as much of the Bible finished as soon as possible and have as early a set of dates as possible, because there's the sense that the longer you allow for things to develop, the more tenuous the relationship between the context of the book and the historical events to which it's referring. Okay, so we want the letters attributed to Paul to be all written by Paul during his lifetime. Obviously, he didn't write anything after his lifetime. And since Jesus didn't write anything, including during his lifetime, we want the documents about Jesus to be as close to Jesus as possible, rather than 100 years later. Okay? So there's this, and yet our manuscript evidence really only kicks in the last quarter of the second century, 175 to 200. Okay. Now that's plausible that, the earlier manuscripts have got lost, but it's interesting. There is this problem of the second century. From the beginning of the third century, 200 plus, the textual evidence is really strong. At 100 CE, there is no textual evidence at all for the New Testament documents. Okay, so we've got this 100-year window in the second century where things are beginning to come together. And the traditional view, of course, is it's really all happened before 100, it's just that it's not left any trace. And the more critical, skeptical view is saying, well, actually it's still coming together through until the middle of the second century, and then within 20 years or so, it begins to show up in the literature although the manuscripts don't appear until the end of the 2nd century. So that's the kind of theological, epistemological kind of issue that's going on there. So 100, round about the turn of the century, 10 to 15 years either side, is going to be my kind of sort of working hypothesis for where we put the Gospel of Matthew. What we're dealing with is the intersection or the convergence, whatever metaphor you want to use, of three worlds or three sets of data or three kind of streams of evidence coming in. We've got to have an explanation that works in the context of the Roman Empire and that meshes with what we know of the high Roman Empire around the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. Okay? And we'll come back to talk about what's going on in Rome at that period. It also has to mesh with what we know about formative Judaism, and a lot of what you'll find in the textbooks claiming to know all this stuff about Jamnia or Javni or so on, it's all wrong, basically. We don't actually know whether there was even such a thing as the Council of Jamnia, but you'll find it being referred to a lot in the literature. So there's got to rethink and reevaluate what we think we know about formative Judaism, how quickly it came together, how quickly it became so organised that groups like Matthew's community would feel that they were in a sense derived from and yet in conflict with mainstream Judaism. Okay, so how do we think, how do we imagine, what do we know, what do we think we know about Judaism in the decades after the destruction of Jerusalem? Okay? And the third kind of set of data, of course, is what do we know about the emergence, and what do we think we know about the emergence of Christianity in that same period? Now, so we've got to be able to make sense of the larger dynamics, the larger contextual reality of the empire. Within that, there's the question of Judaism and what's happening to Judaism and how are people feeling about Judaism from inside and outside in the 60, 70 years or so between the First Rebellion and the Bar Kokhba Rebellion. What's going on there in terms of Judaism? And then what's happening with the Jesus people in that double context of Rome and formative Judaism. Okay? So really this is the time to stop doing 208 and go and do 303, Judaism and Christianity, which is a fantastic subject. And it really just looks at that whole period of basically 200 BCE to 200 AD and looks at what's going on through that time. Okay, some of you know where this is. Yeah, where is this? Can't remember the name. You'll have to come back. Jerash. Yeah, it's the plaza at the southern end of the Decumanus. Okay, sorry, the southern end of the Cardo. Decumanus is the other one. Okay, so this is just a picture to remind us, to evoke this conversation about the Roman context, and not only a Roman context, but of course the Hellenistic culture of the Roman Empire. Jerash is one of the cities of the Decapolis, so the Decapolis really represents in many ways that hybrid of Hellenistic culture and high Roman political organisation, which was characteristic of the Eastern Mediterranean in the time that we're talking about. So places like Bet Shean and Jerash and so on, these were large cities of 20, 30, 40,000 people. And Christianity very much developed as a religion in the cities. But the cities, even when they're Greek cities, pagan cities, Hellenistic cities, they also of course had their own sort of Jewish communities living in those cities because of trade and commerce and other things. So Judaism outside of, if you like, the Jewish heartland of Judea and Galilee, so outside Palestine, Judaism was a phenomenon of the cities. Okay, inside Palestine, you've got Jewish farmers on their traditional holdings doing their traditional thing. But the Jewish diaspora community is an urban community. and they're found in the major trading cities of the ancient world because they're involved in trade and commerce, so on. Christianity emerges in those same cities, and often out of the Jewish diaspora communities. Even if it soon becomes a Gentile phenomenon, its roots are in the diaspora Jewish communities in the large cities of the Hellenistic Roman world. So you get this constant swirling around of empire, Judaism, Christianity, the three dynamics. Okay, we're not going to Jerash this year, we're going to Petra instead. Sub. Okay, so the Roman Empire. Part of the dynamic that's going on here is that the empire, of course, takes shape originally through the foundational kind of work of Augustus, Octavian, who became known as Augustus. And Augustus just means the revered one, the worshipful one you show respect to. Okay, Augustus. And he successfully transmitted, his power to his son Tiberius, who successfully transferred power. So you actually get a series of royal successions, which maintains the sort of Julio-Claudian sort of dynastic succession. And this all comes to a sticky end with Nero's suicide and / murder in the beginning of the year 68. And the year 68-69 was the so-called year of the four emperors, when it looked as if Rome was coming unstuck. Okay? So in the course of that year, you start off with Nero. It's like my first year as a deacon. We lived in 4 different houses in less than 12 months. Look forward to it, guys. Okay, we started out living here, and by the end of the year we were at Groverley, but in the meantime we lived in 2 other parish houses as well. It was a fun year. Okay, it was good for packing. We knew exactly what to put in which box and which way around to put it. We were very good at packing up our stuff by the final shift. So you have a year of chaos when Rome almost collapsed, almost fragmented, as indeed it had done back in the civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian, which culminated with the Battle of Actium in 31 CE. So that's basically 100 years earlier. The empire, when it was not yet a imperial system, it was still a republican system, the empire had almost fallen apart. Okay, so they'd consolidated around Augustus, who'd managed to pass on the power to his family, but by 68 it was back at the point where it was disintegrating again. 4 different claimants to the throne, the last of them being, of course, Vespasian, who was the general in charge of the war against the Jews to suppress the Jewish rebellion. So, and of course he's been predicted that he will become emperor by a recently acquired Jewish captive called Josephus. We'll come back to Josephus a bit later on. So for those people that were involved with the rebellion, it looked like we're going to make it. God's on our side. Rome is coming apart. Rome did not come apart. Vespasian pulled it all back together, consolidated power, and passed it on to his children as well. So you've got chaos, teetering on the brink of collapse, minority government, if you like, and then a period of consolidation. So the point of making this reference is that the next couple of decades, Rome is all about consolidation, stability, respectability, family values. Men should be in charge, women should be in the kitchen or the bedroom, and so on. So the Roman Empire goes into a very conservative phase in the decades just before and just after the turn of the century. And we actually see that happening in early Christian literature as well. The more radical ideas of Paul become much more traditional when you get to the pastoral epistles. Women should be silent, men should be in charge, da-da-da-da-da. You get that sort of stuff in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, reflecting what's going on in the larger Greco-Roman world. So after the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors, Rome has got a big investment in stability and good order and traditional gender roles. Thank you very much. Okay. So we have Domitian, who follows, you got Vespasian, who's followed just very briefly by Titus, who only reigned a couple of years, then he died. And then we get Domitian, who reigns for about 15 years, 81 to 96. And Domitian is the one who really ramps up the emperor cult and wants to be acknowledged as Lord, or God and Saviour. Deus, okay, or Theos and Soter.
Titus was the general in charge of the...
General was the son who was left behind when Vespasian went back to Rome to take up his new appointment. Okay. Vespasian was the general in charge, but he was assisted by his sons, all very sort of nepotistic. Vespasian is acclaimed by his army as emperor, but he then has to go and he has to actually take the prize. Okay, so he leaves Titus behind. So Titus is actually in charge of the army, the legions, for the rest of the campaign against Jerusalem and Masada.
So he's there 80-70 as the general.
Yeah. So he's sort of taken over command of the army because his father's just been acclaimed emperor. And then he doesn't actually reign for that long because of health issues and age, and then he's followed by Domitian. I think it was his younger brother. Okay, who reigned from 81 to 96 and was, in some ways, a successful ruler, but from a Christian theological point of view, he was a nasty ruler because of the impact of the emperor cult. And many people place the book of Revelation in the context of the reign of Domitian because of the insistence on emperor worship, emperor cult. And emperor cult is about consolidating power, okay, and invoking the power of religion to stabilise the political system. Okay, it's not that people really thought he was God incarnate, but that you showed the emperor had godlike power, and religion consolidated those political claims. There's again a very elderly emperor, Nerva, who rules for a couple of years from basically 96, 97, early part of 98, and then he's followed by Trajan, who ultimately will be followed by Hadrian. Who's the next one? Okay, so Domitian, Trajan, and Hadrian are three very significant Roman emperors at the end of the 1st century and beginning of the 2nd century. And we know Hadrian from Hadrian's Wall. Come on in. So Hadrian will be important for us, and of course Hadrian, there's the arch and the hippodrome and so on at say Jerash from Hadrian. He was a guy that got around a lot, and both Trajan and Hadrian had issues to deal with in terms of Jewish unrest. We talk about the major Jewish rebellions, the War of 66 to 73 and the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132-135, but there's also a smaller Jewish uprising from 115 to 117. So during the time of Trajan, there's more political activity to suppress the Jewish rebellion, basically in the Galilee. Okay. So Trajan and Hadrian in particular have to deal with significant problems to do with Jewish rebellions in the East. So this is all part of this, again, this intersection between Roman imperial power and Jewish recovery, Jewish consolidation, and the emergence of formative Judaism in the 50, 60 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? And we'll come to that in just a moment. So we're going to have to locate Matthew somewhere in this period. Now, if Matthew is dated in the 80s, 85 to 90, as most people probably say, then it comes out during the time of Domitian. Okay? If it's just after the if it's just around the turn of the century, then it's going to be in the time of Trajan. And if it's closer to the Bar Kokhba rebellion, then of course it's going to be in the time of Hadrian. So these are the three major political rulers that around at the time. Okay, so for instance, the blood curse in Matthew 27, his blood be upon us and our children. I mean that's a horrible verse, and it's led to all kinds of Christian anti-Semitism over the centuries, but it belongs in the context of these three rulers, of one or other of these rulers, and it belongs in a context of constant Jewish resistance. The war was over, but the country had not been pacified. Okay, so Rome had won the war, but the Jews were still fighting the battles. There were still outbreaks. And indeed there were rebellions in the 80s in different Jewish communities around the eastern Mediterranean. So the Jewish question in the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, was an unresolved political problem for Rome. And that's also the context for Josephus, and it's the context for Matthew and Mark as well. Okay? So let's go then to the question of formative Judaism. This particular scene, of course, is on the Arch of Titus in Rome, because Titus was eventually the general who captured Jerusalem. Okay? So on his return to Rome, he's given a public parade called a triumph, where they march through with the captive booty and also some of the captives from Jerusalem, and they issued coins, Judea Captiva and so on, to commemorate the fact that Judah had been captured. And of course there's our best representation of what the menorah looked like from the temple, because it's on the side of the Arch of Titus, which still stands in Rome. Okay.
So, what's the, it was just like a war over territory, not a war not a religious war.
Which one? 66 to 73.
Yeah.
It was a Jewish rebellion where they refused to pay taxes and refused to acknowledge the power of Rome, the emperor's authority.
If they'd just been quiet, occupied people, they would have been tolerated.
Oh yeah, this was not anti-Jewish. And in fact, one of the things that's often forgotten is that Herod Agrippa II continued to be the king of the Jews until his death in about 96. Okay, and indeed he led a Jewish army on the side of the Roman Empire against the Jewish rebels during 66 to 73. So it was not anti-Jewish, and it wasn't even anti-Agrippa. It was because he was the last of the sort of Herodian rulers. This was that the politics, the social dynamics in Palestine themselves had become so difficult, and they were blessed with a series of incompetent rulers, so Roman governors and so on, that eventually the system exploded, and it was a mix of sort of messianic aspirations and frustrations over debt and taxation and so on. And it fed into this amazing apocalyptic potion. Now the Christians were drinking the same potion, okay? But the Christians didn't identify and participate in the rebellion to the same extent. And that also then becomes part of the dynamic between formative Judaism and emergent Christianity. And there's clearly continuity between formative Judaism and Second Temple Judaism. And when the sort of labels I'm using are coming from a guy called Jacob Neusner, but basically sort of rabbinic Judaism is the Judaism of the 2nd century, the Judaism of, say, the Mishnah and ultimately the Talmud. And it's Judaism without a temple. It's Judaism with the scriptures, but the scriptures interpreted through the matrix of Mishnah and Talmud, and the leadership taken by the rabbis, not by the Sadducees, not by the prince, not by the Davidic dynasty, etc. So that's Judaism of the form that is a distinct entity, and from a Christian perspective, that's our other. That's the other group that's like us, but they're other. But Judaism in the time of Jesus is not rabbinic Judaism. And Judaism from the Second Temple is not the Judaism of the First Temple period. So we can distinguish different phases in the development of Judaism. Now, of course, contemporary Jews claim continuity, and rightly claim continuity with biblical Judaism, post-biblical Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, and sort of rabbinic Judaism. But they're not the same as rabbinic Judaism either, because they're on this side of the Renaissance. They're on this side of the Enlightenment. They're on this side of the Shoah. And of course, there's also the deep divide between Ashkenazi Jews in Israel and Sephardic Jews in Israel. Ashkenazi being Jews from Europe, okay, and Sephardic being Jews from the Middle East. Now, their cultural and historical experiences are entirely different. There's a fascinating piece from Haaretz that I put on Facebook last week by an Israeli Jewish woman, scholar, who's now living in New York, like lots of Jews, and she describes herself as an Arab Jew because she's Sephardic, and her first language is Arabic. Her music, she said, when people hear us chanting our prayers, they think they've walked into a mosque, because the musical tone system of the Sephardic is Middle Eastern, not European. You walk into an Orthodox Jewish synagogue, it sounds a bit like a Baptist or Presbyterian church, because they've been acculturated to 2,000 years of European Christianity. Okay, whereas the Sephardic Jews have been enculturated through 2,000 years of the Middle East, including 1,300 years of Islam. So their language, their music, their culture is very Islamic or Arabic. Okay, so there's great diversity within Judaism now, and there was similarly different but significant diversity in Judaism around the middle of the first century. And part of what happens after the destruction of the temple is the emergence of formative Judaism, which is a sort of let's pick up the pieces and reorganize our community and move into the future. Now, they wouldn't even describe their community as being Judaism. Okay, that's a label applied to Jews by outsiders. That's not their label for themselves at the time. And therefore, one of the problematic aspects when we're doing Matthean studies is people talk about Jewish Christians, but that's a category error. Not because you can't be Jewish and Christian, but because the people at the time didn't use that language for themselves. Okay, so there were some Jews who were interested in Jesus, and there were some Christians that had high levels of Jewish cultural affinity and religious continuity. But Jewish Christian is not necessarily the most appropriate label for that phenomenon, although it's one that you'll find in the literature a lot. Jewish Christians and sort of Jewish Christianity and the Ebionites, da-da-da-da-da. Well, we're putting our labels on them rather than allowing them to describe themselves. So, back to formative Judaism. So, the loss of Jerusalem and the loss of the temple are of immense significance for Judaism at the time. And one of the most important insights of the last couple of decades about this period is that what we call Judaism or Rabbinic Judaism or formative Judaism and what we call early Christianity are the twin daughters of Second Temple Judaism. Okay, they're twin religions which emerge from the loss of the temple. And one of them is focused on Torah and one of them is focused on Jesus. But they're not unrelated phenomena. Okay, and it's not that formative Judaism is in perfect continuity and consistent harmony with Second Temple Judaism. There's a lot more diversity, a lot more apocalyptic ideas and so on in Second Temple Judaism. If you take, for example, the text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay? These are not only grumpy old priests that don't like the change of the prayer book in the temple, they've also got really weird ideas about the end of the world and the part they're going to play in the end of the world, okay? And how they're all going to line up like the Battle of Jericho, and the priests are going to be out the front with their banners. That's a great way to have a battle, send the priests out the front. These days we perhaps do it by sending out front, say, the politicians first, and then the young men, rather than the young men first, and then the politicians. There'd be, I think, a lot fewer wars if the politicians had to go first, rather than the young people. So, and in their view, this was about sort of struggle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. They were, of course, on the side of the sons of light. The Romans were obviously on the side of the sons of darkness. And if they kept themselves pure and said all their prayers properly, when the great battle came, they would win. Except nobody told the Romans that they were supposed to lose, and so the Romans won. Okay? Because you don't win battles by saying prayers and marching around 7 times and splashing yourself with holy water. You win battles because you've got better weapons and better soldiers. Okay, so that whole apocalyptic thing is gradually being phased out through formative Judaism, but it's still there by the time of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. That's the last hurrah of that apocalyptic sort of messianic fervour. Whereas in Christianity, apocalyptic messianic fervour is also there, but it's redirected and rechanneled and spiritualised and projected into the future. So it can't hurt anybody in the meantime. Okay, now they weren't doing it consciously. They weren't saying this is not going to work. We don't have enough guns here, enough swords. We better postpone our apocalyptic fantasies to some remote time in the future. In the meantime, have kids and build houses. Okay, but that's what they were doing. Okay, and it's because they're in a different social dynamic than the Jewish community that actually do have an attachment to land in a way that the Christians did not have. Okay? So the loss of Jerusalem and the temple has to have been of immense significance for Jews of whatever ilk, including the Jews who thought Jesus was the answer to whatever question you might want to ask. Okay? And of course, we don't know how Paul would have dealt with the psychological, theological shock of the destruction of Jerusalem, because he's dead before it happens. Okay? So we don't know how people like Paul would have dealt with this. But we do know what people like Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, how they dealt with it in the decades immediately after the war. So they not only lost Jerusalem and they not only lost its temple, but they lost their political class. Shock horror. Okay, a world without politicians. And there's too many N's in that version of Sanhedrin. Okay, so their natural leadership was basically taken out by this process. Now, if you think about it, that's almost the opposite of what happened at the time of the Babylonian exile, where the political leadership, the priests, the prophets, the kings, and so on, the royal family, were taken into exile, but they were not exterminated. They continued to provide leadership and cohesion to the community. And within a generation or so, they're more or less back in town, picking up the pieces, replugging things. The adults are back in charge, and away they go. Whereas that's not going to happen in the context of the Roman Empire, and it's certainly not going to happen when you have the double header of the sort of Zealot revolt in 66 and the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132, and all the other little fires that broke out in the meantime. Okay, so So we find that Trajan and Hadrian in particular move into this process of de-Judaizing Palestine, turning Jerusalem into a pagan city, Aelia Capitolina, banning Jews from even setting foot inside the city. Okay, setting up a temple to Jupiter on what had been the temple site, and reorganising the political boundaries so that the political unit, instead of being Judea, becomes Palestina, which was an ancient name for the land going back to the 5th, 6th century or even the 10th century, but now in Roman public administration this is the land of Palestine, and while there were Jews living in the Galilee and so on, they were not allowed to go to Jerusalem. All of this stuff has an impact on who's who in the zoo and how you're feeling about the other animals, kind of thing. Okay. So yes, there's still, at least initially, there's the court of Agrippa II based at Caesarea Philippi or Banias, and he still has a very good friend called Flavius Josephus who has a government pension in Rome and is literally sending his friend Agrippa drafts of his history of the Jewish people for Agrippa to comment on. Okay? So there's this cultural elite in the north which is pro-Roman and thoroughly antagonised or disconnected from grassroots Jewish life. And it's just a leftover. There's not going to be any future for that little bubble after the end of the life of Agrippa. He's the last of those, and he's finished in 66, but he keeps his job till he dies, just before the turn of the century. So Jerusalem's gone, the temple's gone, and the political leadership of Sanhedrin and the Sadducees and the priestly families, the Herodian families, all gone. In their place, you get the emergence of the synagogue, which was an older institution, but it now becomes much more important. And the synagogue becomes the centre for Jewish life. And it's ideally suited to a dispersed, it's like first century internet. Okay? You could take out the temple, but you can't take out the synagogues. You can take out one synagogue, but you can't destroy the synagogue network. Okay, so it's very much like the model of the internet. And so the synagogue becomes the locus for Jewish identity, Jewish values, Jewish education and Jewish worship. And the leader of the synagogue, or the rabbi, will become much more important. And the focus, of course, is very much around scripture and also oral tradition. There's another typo there to fix up later. Okay. So the kind of Judaism which is emerging towards the end of the 1st century and into the beginning of the 2nd century is exactly the kind of Judaism we find represented in Matthew's Gospel. Except, of course, that Matthew is talking about a time when the temple is still there and Jesus is able to go to the temple and so on. But the kind of people and the kind of arguments Jesus is having in the Galilee with Pharisees and scribes and so on are the kinds of arguments Matthew's community is having with their opponents. Then we come to the Christian, emergent Christianity phase of what we're talking about. Okay, so what's going on in the Jesus corner? Well, you've got Paul and his Christ cult assemblies, which in many ways are piggybacking off the Jewish diaspora synagogue communities, but quickly falling out with them because they're not orthodox from a Jewish perspective. Okay, they're giving a unnecessary and inappropriate level of devotion to this Jesus guy, rather than Moses, Torah, God. So there's a different kind of organising of the spiritual realities. at the same time, and as part of the contest of what's going on in the first couple of decades after Easter, you've also got the more Torah observant expressions of what we would call Christianity. And again, that wasn't their label for themselves at the time, okay, but Torah observant Jesus movement, if you like, which for us is probably symbolised by James. And again, interestingly, James, the brother of the Lord. Okay? So the better connections in the early Jesus movement are the Jewish connections. Now, Paul is thoroughly Jewish, but Paul is not part of the original crowd. Okay? He's not one of the Jesus people. He never knew Jesus. He wasn't one of the apostolic circle, in the original apostolic circle. He's an outsider, a ring-in. Okay? And he's pushing the boundaries and he's changing stuff. And he's saying you don't have to keep Torah and you don't have to be circumcised. And people like James are saying, yes, you do. At least if you're a bloke, yes, you do. Okay? So the kind of dynamics we see in Galatians 2 and in passages like Acts chapter 15 reflect this kind of dynamic going on between different streams within the Jesus movement. So just as there's diversity within Judaism, there's diversity within Christianity. And both of those labels are anachronistic, particularly for the period prior to the Jewish war, but even for the period after the Jewish war. Then you have the kinds of traditions that we find in the Pseudo-Clementine literature, which are basically more radical Jewish expressions of Christianity, and in particular expressions of Christianity which see Paul as a heretic. Okay, so during the final part of the first century into perhaps the early part of the second century, Paul had his promoters, but Paul also had his detractors. Now, on the Pauline ticket are people like Ignatius, the third bishop of Antioch. Okay, people like Marcion, the great heretic, but he's a Paul fan. And whoever wrote Luke Acts thinks Paul is the best thing since sliced bread. And they don't know about sliced bread, so Paul really is the best thing, okay? So the picture I'm trying to paint here is that within early Christianity, and particularly the last couple of decades of the first century and the first couple of decades of the second century, there's this diversity of opinion within Christianity, not only about Jesus, not only about Torah, but also about Paul. For some people, Paul's terrific. For other people, he's a real problem. Okay? Not to mention the Johannine communities, which represent yet another trajectory within early Christianity. Okay? And who have their own troubled relationship with the synagogue communities, and that's another label that can be used, another term that can be used for Torah observant Judaism, can be referred to as the synagogue community versus the Jesus community. Okay, the people who gathered in the synagogues. So the Johannine community has its own issues, its own internal conflicts, its own divisions and scandals and so on. They're the ones, after all, who give us the word Antichrist. And it's not used for the emperor, it's used for a Christian who you don't agree with. Okay? So it's an internal term of Christian abuse. It's not an external label for somebody persecuting the church.
Because there's been much scholarship done on the connection between Johannine sort of thinking. I'm just thinking of Thomas. There's like links across.
Yeah.
Some of Thomas's ideas and John's ideas.
Yep.
And yet there's also links to Paul in some of the theology there. And has anyone done any research on the Pauline communities and the John community kind of relationship, or what's the intersection there between because there are some different theologies being presented.
Yeah. So I thought you were asking about John and Thomas, because there is work on John and Thomas as well. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of any work that's particularly done around Paul and John connections. I mean, earlier work by Raymond Brown looks, the churches the apostles left behind. He looks a chapter on Paul and a chapter on John, a chapter on Matthew, a chapter on Luke, and so on.
It's that cross-pollination of ideas that really intrigues me, and it does. I mean, I'm looking at Thomas. I think Thomas and John, there does seem to be a cross-pollination.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to I've read a few articles, to look at also the Pauline kind of theology. So yeah. Yep. Yeah, anyway, just curious because I'm like that's a.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are people doing that work. I'm just not. It's not the bit of the patch I dig in, so I'm not particularly aware of it. But and certainly the big picture is that by the early to the middle part, well, certainly by say the middle of the 2nd century, Paul has won. Paul is rehabilitated. Paul is to Christianity what the Mishnah will be to Judaism. It's the crystallizing, pulling it all together kind of development. So that Matthew and John only survive, or Matthean and Johannine expressions of Christianity only survive to the extent they come into line with the great church, because the great church is lined up behind Paul. He's got the bishops, he's got the canon, eventually he'll have the creeds, and so the Jewish Christians and the Johannine Christians and the Gnostics and the Marcionites and so on, they're basically, whether they're in or out, is determined by their relationship with Pauline great church, sort of Catholic Christianity. Whereas in Matthew, we're dealing with a stage when that has not yet happened. Because clearly, it's fairly clear, we might get a chance to talk about some passages, but it's pretty clear that Matthew represents a view of Christianity which dissents from the Pauline view of Christianity. Now sits within a canon, which is a Pauline canon. Okay, so the canon, it represents a peace deal between the Mattheans and the Johannines and the Paulines. But Matthew represents a point in time when Paul has not yet won. Okay, it's getting close, perhaps. Matthew's view of Christianity might be a view which is just about expired at the time it's being written, but it's still a live option, and Paul has not yet won the day, or Paul and his followers have not yet won the day, as it were. The Didache also comes into play here. The Didache is a text, early Christian text. It's a church order. Have you all done early rise of Christianity? Church to 500. Now 20% extra, church to 600. Okay. So the Didache is a really significant text, discovered late in the 19th century. It's an early church order, how to do church, around about the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. And it seems to, the only gospel it seems to know about is the Matthean gospel. So again, it represents, in this Didache, we're dealing with traditions which are closer to the Matthean tradition. Okay? And so it's not surprising that there's a version of the Lord's Prayer in the Didache, and it's closer to Matthew's version than Luke's version.
Would that say that it was pro-written in that community then? Not outside of that community?
It depends how firm a thing you want community to be. Most people, I think, would say that Didache and Matthew both come from, when they say Syria, they really mean the coast, the area which today is Lebanon and the coast of Syria and the southern part of Turkey. So just as the Mediterranean's about to turn the bottom of Turkey, all of that is ancient Syria. and that patch seems to be where things like Matthew and the Didache and Mark even come out of that patch. So it's not a tightly knit community in that sense. Not like, say, a Johannine community might be a community that has stronger boundaries. Okay, whereas the Matthean or the more Torah observant Christianity communities might be more diverse and less of a sense of boundary than we find in the Johannine and even maybe the Pauline communities. Okay. But we don't know. I mean, we're trying to join dots, and we don't have enough dots to get a really good picture. Okay. But the Didache also represents and preserves traditions from an if you like, an earlier phase of church where it's almost rare to have a permanent local priest or pastor, and you have these wandering prophets coming through. Okay, so it's in that stage of transition from the more sort of itinerant expressions of Christian ministry to the more settled, local, stay in one place, don't move around type of ministry. The other one that probably should be on this list actually would of course be the Sayings Gospel Q, or what some of the documents, particularly Lutz, likes to call the Palestinian saying source. Okay, and again there are overlaps between Q obviously and Matthew and also Gospel of Thomas. There's a convergence of materials there. But particularly 2 Peter is worth mentioning. 2 Peter is often seen by more critical scholars as probably the last of the New Testament books to have been written. And of course 2 Timothy has that famous passage, chapter 3 verse 15 or whatever, which talks about the letters of Paul. And it's so you have to get an internal, and similarly James, which I've already mentioned the character of James, but really it's the letter of James which is the more significant thing, which seems to be in a debate with Paul over law and faith and works. In 2 Peter, the author is saying, well, this is the same kind of stuff that Paul tried to explain in his letters, which have some really difficult passages in them, which the unwise and the foolish twist to their own destruction, just as they do the other scriptures. Wow. So Paul is already in the category of scripture by the time of 2 Peter. And it's being misused just like other scriptures are misused by misguided and foolish people. And it does have some difficult ideas. So I realise not everybody likes Paul. Not everybody agrees with him. But really, what I'm telling you is the same stuff that Paul was trying to tell you in his letters, but he doesn't always say it as well as I'm saying it. That's what 2 Peter is saying.
And when do we think 2 Peter was written?
Most people would say around 125. Now, to me, that's no longer the last of the New Testament letters, but anyway. But people that date Luke and so on back inside the first century still tend to date 2 Peter as around about 120, 125. So it's often seen as one of the last of the letters. And, of course, nothing at all to do with Peter. Okay, so we've got this Roman context. We've got the realities, the dynamics of formative Judaism, and then you've got this diverse and conflicted phenomenon of the Jesus movement, which is coming to terms with who they are and where they're going and so on. And yet they've got their own challenges. They will have been invested to some extent in Jerusalem and the temple, and the destruction of the temple, destruction of Jerusalem, as an event of large theological significance, if only because where's Jesus when you need him? Okay, isn't he supposed to come back now? Where is he? Meanwhile, Paul and Peter and da-da-da-da-da have died. So we're into the second generation of leadership in something which, again, nobody started out Christianity with the idea. Now we're actually setting up an organisation that's going to be the longest running multinational corporation in human history. Okay? It's going to out-Roman the Romans. It's going to last for 2,000 years, da-da-da-da-da. I mean, there's been nothing like the Roman Catholic Church, if you want to put it that way, in terms of human cultural developments and so on. But nobody had that in mind in 31 or 35 or 39 or 42 of the Common Era. They're doing their stuff, coming to terms with what they understand God was doing in Jesus. They're expecting Jesus to pop back any time and wrap up the show. And the ideal time for him to oblige would have been during the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman armies. And Jesus is missing in action. So for the Jewish people, the temple's gone, but for Christian people, where's Jesus? That's a major theological problem as well. Is he coming back? When's he coming back? What do we do in the meantime? Become critical issues. And to some extent, the Synoptic Gospels are an answer to that in a way which the letters of Paul never were, because they're written before then. They don't deal with that question. We can read them with that question in mind, but they're not written to address that question. Okay? So we've got these three sets of diverse. Rome's trying to bolt everything down. No messing around, guys. No, don't want rebellions. Don't want women in charge of their own sexuality. You know, everything has to be bolted down in a solid patriarchal order. Okay. Hence some of the horror, some of the early Christian stories that are this issue about the virgins. Okay. Women need to be married off. So some guy's in charge of it. Every woman is accountable to some man who will keep her in her place. Okay? And we see the pastoral epistles trying to organise everything so everybody's in their place and behaves themselves. That's very Roman end of the first century, start of second century social policy. Okay? The Jews are trying to pick up the pieces and work out what do we do with the leftovers, and the Christians are coming along without a long history of being Christian, and they're also needing to define. And one of their answers up until 70 AD had been, well, we're part of the Jewish community, but we're following our Rabbi Jesus. And now the Jewish community is saying, oh, no, you're not, thank you very much. You're not coming to our synagogue. Okay, so there's another dynamic coming into play there as well. Okay, so the problem of Matthew's context is a problem of timing. How do we date this stuff? It's a problem of geography. Whereabouts do we think this is happening? It's a problem of outlook. What's the theology or the ideology? What are the key ideas and the perspectives? And in particular, what are the attitudes to the other people that we find in Matthew's Gospel? And it's also a problem of relationships with the synagogue community and relationships with other Christian communities. And it's quite possible, for instance, that if we're thinking about the church in Antioch, we had to pluralise the word church. It's possible that the Christian presence in the ancient city of Antioch was represented by multiple expressions of Christianity. That there were both Pauline communities and more Torah observant communities. And the New Testament actually tells us that. Yeah? The stories about Peter and Paul having arguments at Antioch about table fellowship and so on, they're stories that reflect an undercurrent of conflict and disagreement over where to draw the boundaries, where to draw the lines, who's in, who's out. According to the book of Acts, Antioch is where the followers of Jesus are first called Christians. Okay? That's where Paul comes from in terms of his beginning his missionary activity with Barnabas and so on. That's where James turns up, or the followers of James. It's where Peter turns up. So Antioch is like, the major crossroads for the early Jesus movement as they begin to sort of move out from Palestine into the rest of the Roman world. So when we think about the church, the community of Torah observant Christians with a Jewish background, which appear to be the Matthean constituency, they may not have been the only Jesus people in town. So what was their relationship like with the others? Okay, so just a reminder of the geography. We're talking about Antioch. You can see it up in the top right-hand corner there. And you can see the Sea of Galilee at about 4 o'clock on that map. Okay. Now the Christian heartland during the 2nd century is basically going to be Asia Minor, which includes Antioch on the Orontes, because there's more than one Antioch, of course, in the ancient world. Okay. So, and you can see Antioch has major strategic advantages as a transport hub. In a world before airlines, Antioch's a pretty important place. Okay?
Does it have what is it called now? Is there still a...
Yeah, Antakya, which of course is Antioch in Arabic or Turkish. But these days it's part of... I think it is part of Turkey these days. But remember, the modern national boundaries simply reflect the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the bits taken by the British and the French. So what's in Turkey, what's in Syria, what's in Lebanon, what's in Palestine, what's in Jordan are the results of British and French bureaucrats putting lines on the map. And those lines will be adjusted inevitably over time. Okay, so this is the context. So the Jesus movement starts down in the bottom right-hand corner, as it were. But Matthew is Matthew and Paul, really, because that's the other thing about Antioch. Antioch is the base in many ways for the Pauline mission, but it's also a very Jewish place, a strong Jewish presence. And remembering, Paul is an observant Jew. Okay, good, well-trained. And Paul himself comes from Cilicia, which is just a little bit, you can't particularly see it on the map, but just northwest across the water from Antioch is Tarsus, Paul's hometown. Okay. And by Paul's own account, he was somebody who in that diaspora Jewish community was given a very good rabbinic education, studied with Gamaliel and so on. Okay. And somebody who, in his own words, in places like Philippians, describes himself as a Jewish, Hebrew of Hebrews, from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, so somebody who's, correctly or not, who still has a family tradition that they're Benjaminites within the total Israelite thing. So he's a 1st century Jew with Roman citizenship. Again, Roman world, Jewish world, Christian world. He's a 1st century Jew from the diaspora in what will become the Christian heartland, who's a Roman citizen, has a rabbinic education, and a family pedigree where it's important to him to identify as a Benjaminite. And there haven't been any significant social advantages in being a Benjaminite since the death of Saul. Okay? But the tradition is kept alive in his family.
He's an interesting crossbreed then, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a hybrid, as we all are, of course. All right. So the parameters. Gee, how did we get there? Look at the time. I didn't think we had enough to fill the time up today. Okay, so the big parameters are, of course, things like mark and priority. If, as appears to be the case, the Gospel of Matthew is using Mark as one of its major sources, then that has implications for dating and it has implications for authorship. This is not an apostle of Jesus, who knew Jesus personally, if he's using the Greek Gospel of Mark as the basic source for his narrative. Okay, it just doesn't figure that he could possibly be Matthew the apostle thinking in Aramaic and so on. He's clearly drawn on the Sayings Gospel Q, which some people call the Palestinian Sayings source, and which we're now beginning to wonder whether it's actually very close to Marcion's own version of the Gospel, the Evangelion. And that the Matthew's version of Q and Marcion's version of Q, if you like, might have more in common than Luke's version of Q has with them. So it's a realignment of some of the patterns. Certainly we've got a document with a strong interest in Jewish themes, more so than we find in other parts of the Gospels. And it's especially interested in the relationship between Jesus and Torah. And we find a lot of interest, a lot of references to the Pharisees, to the scribes, and to the Pharisees and scribes together. So just picking up the basic data. Okay, Pharisaios occurs about probably about 60% of the references to the Pharisees and scribes are Pharisees, and about 40% are references to the grammatus, or the scribes, the scholars. Okay, again, in terms of technical stuff, that's just a right click once you've gone to the results pane in your recording software, chosen whichever of the graphics you want to use, right click, copy picture, paste into your Word document or your PowerPoint or whatever, and there it is. Okay. Same sort of thing. This is looking at the distribution of the two terms, Pharisees and scribes, across the Gospels. Okay, and this is hits per 1,000 words. So Matthew has a fair bit of interest, in particular because Matthew 23 stands out as a high point or a low point for this kind of conversation. Methodologically then, what we're dealing with is an anonymous text. The text itself does not identify authorship, so on. Of course, you've got the prologues or the superscriptions in the early manuscripts, but these are going to be no earlier than the 3rd and 4th century. Okay. There's no explicit indication of location, okay, and that's true for all of the Gospels. There are very few chronological markers, other than obviously the story is coming out of the time of Jesus, so we get some references to Herod and Pilate and Caiaphas and so on, and we can date those characters. And so we're having to triangulate data that comes from various domains and kind of work out what that says to us. Okay, and we're looking for an explanation, or at least a working hypothesis about the Matthean context, which gives us the best fit with date, place, theology, and the larger context. Okay. So dating Matthew, if it's after Mark, then it can't be any, and Mark is usually dated, a couple of years after the end of the Jewish War, which means at the earliest around 75, something like that. And it's usual to say that it's before the time of Ignatius of Antioch, who was martyred in 107. Okay. So you'll find most discussions of the date of Matthew say it has to be after Mark's Gospel, has to be available and known to Ignatius, in the first few years of the 2nd century. So typically people say it comes from the 80s, mid-80s. Okay? So almost everything after Paul ends up being dated to around 85 to 90. So, because we know so little about that period, so you put everything there. Okay. However, as it happens, both the dating of Mark and the dating of the letters of Ignatius have been challenged in the last little while. Now, and we don't have to agree that we've been totally persuaded, but as soon as you actually start fiddling with the date of Mark or fiddling with the authenticity of the letters of Ignatius, then those traditional parameters disappear, or at least get modified. Okay? So just very quickly, especially given the time. So dating Mark, that doesn't mean going out with a boy called Mark, but simply trying to put a date on Mark. Okay. It's conventional to date Mark shortly after 70 CE. Okay? For all the reasons we've talked about. There are a few people who suggested time before the Jewish war, and there are occasional suggestions that Mark comes out of the crisis around the attempt of the Emperor Caligula to put his own a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem, and that's the crisis in Mark chapter 13 and so on, not the Jewish war. Okay, but generally speaking, most synoptic gospel scholarship would see Mark as something that's been written after the Jewish war, but close to the Jewish war, not very long afterwards. Theodore Whedon, however, I didn't bring it in. Actually, after all, that's on my desk. Theodore Whedon, in some work about 10 years ago now, is actually suggesting that the Gospel of Mark was written no earlier than the 80s and possibly late 80s. All right. I'll come to the reasoning. I just want you to think about the impact. So, and basically his argument is going to be that Mark is dependent on Josephus. Okay, and he's got literary arguments for that. Okay, so if that's in any sense upheld, then of course that straight away means that any other document which is reliant on Mark has to be even later. So it's not just as per David Sims' article, which I'm sure you've all read really closely. Okay, I won't ask you to put your hand up. I'm sure Daniel's read it, but he's not. He's not.
It's probably summarised it and handed you a draft.
Teacher's pet. Yeah. He'll enjoy this bit of the movie. Okay. So here, what Sims is talking about, which we'll do in a minute, is that the letters of Ignatius are being dated considerably later in the 2nd century. Okay. But in fact, even the dating for the Gospel of Mark is being rethought in some circles. Okay? And we'll come to the reasons why. So he's suggesting it was written in the region of Caesarea Philippi, okay, during the last years of the Jewish court of Agrippa II, and that it's dependent on Josephus, and that copies of Josephus were available to people in the region of Caesarea Philippi in the mid to late 80s, because Josephus was, as he tells us himself, he was sending copies of his work across to his buddy King Agrippa II for comment and so on. So we actually have historical information which would confirm that the works of Josephus were circulating in Caesarea Philippi during the course, as they're being drafted, as they're being written. Okay.
Why do you think that Josephus referred to Jesus?
Stay tuned. Ta-da! In particular, his description of a person known as Jesus, the son of Ananias. Okay? Now there is a passage in Josephus that refers to Jesus Christ, but its authenticity is suspect, and there are various issues around it. But there's another section where he talks about a weird prophet called Jesus, the son of Ananias, who walks round and round Jerusalem predicting the destruction of the city, and eventually is arrested, beaten, scourged, and killed. Okay? So here it is. This is the passage. This is going to take 4 or 5 slides, so I'll just quickly run through it. But what is still more terrible, there was one Jesus, the son of Ananias it should be, a plebeian and a husbandman. So just an ordinary person, no social status, a pleb, who 4 years before the war began, and at a time when the city was in very great peace and prosperity, came to that feast where it is our custom for everyone to make tabernacles to God. So the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkoth, okay. And he came to the temple and began on a sudden to cry aloud, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, a voice against this whole people. In other words, this Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem at a time when everything's good. The garbage is being collected, the roads are good, and the electricity is working, everything's fine. This was his cry as he went about by day and by night in all the lanes of the city. However, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, and took up the man and gave him a great number of severe stripes. That's one way of saying they beat him up. Yet did not he either say anything for himself or anything peculiar to those that chastised him, so he suffered in silence and did not revile those who persecuted him. It's beginning to sound like someone else. But still went on with the same words which he cried before. He stayed on theme, like a modern politician who's been given his media briefing for the morning, and every journalist who interviews him gets the same line. Hereupon our rulers, supposing, as the case proved to be, that this was a sort of divine fury in the man, brought him to the Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare. Yet he did not make any supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible, at every stroke of the whip his answer was, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." Okay? Don't cry for me, daughters of Jerusalem. Cry rather for those, when the time comes. And when Albinus, for he was then our procurator, asked him who he was and whence he came and why he uttered such words, he made no manner of reply to what he said, but still did not leave off his melancholy ditty till Albinus took him to be a madman and dismissed him. Okay, I'm not going to waste my time with you, nutter. Now, during all the time that passed before the war began, this man did not go near any of the citizens, nor was he seen by them while he said so. But he every day uttered these lamentable words, as if it were his premeditated vow, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." Nor did he give ill words to any of those that beat him every day, nor good words to those who gave him food. But this was his reply to all men, and indeed no other than a melancholic presage of what was to come. This cry of his was loudest at the festivals. I mean, you'd really look forward to this guy turning up. You're doing the cathedral service, wouldn't you? For 7 years, he was a serial pest. Okay? For 7 years and 5 months, without growing hoarse or being tired therewith, until the very time that he saw his presage in earnest fulfilled in our siege, when it ceased. So once Jerusalem was under siege by the Romans, he stopped predicting the destruction of the city. For as he was going around upon the wall, he cried out with his utmost voice, "Woe, woe to the city again, and to the people, and to the holy house." And just as he added at the last, "Woe, woe to me also," there came a stone out of one of the engines and smote him and killed him immediately. And as he was uttering up the very same presages, he gave up the ghost. Okay. Now that passage has been in Josephus for almost 2,000 years, and you don't hear about it much in church circles. But here's another guy, Jesus, who's predicting the destruction of Jerusalem and is taken to the Roman official and whipped and beaten, and he doesn't revile his persecutors and eventually dies outside the city and so on. So it's not the Jesus, our Jesus story, but it's a remarkably similar story. Okay? Now, what Whedon has argued is that rather than Gospel of Mark and Josephus both knowing this story, basically a number of scholars have argued that Mark's passion narrative is basically a retelling of that story with Jesus of Nazareth as the main character rather than Jesus ben Ananias. And they've assumed that Mark is written in the 70s, Josephus in the 80s, and they both know this story from some other source. What Whedon has done is do a close analysis of the Josephus stuff and the Markan story, and he's tried to establish that in fact Mark has used Josephus for his basic story of the Passion of Jesus. All right? Now, if he's right, then the Gospel of Mark is no earlier than the mid-80s and possibly late 80s. All right? Which then has a knock-on effect from Matthew and Luke. And John, for that matter, who clearly has pinched Mark's passion narrative for his passion narrative. Okay, so there's a rethinking going on about the date of Mark's Gospel. Who knows how that will pan out in the end. But he's made a reasonably cogent argument. Then there's the issue which David Sim alludes to about the redating of the letters of Ignatius. Traditionally, they're dated to the time of Trajan and prior to the death of Ignatius, which would make sense. But Sim has noted that a strong case has been made by two different scholars for a much later date, and that basically the letters of Ignatius are forgeries, just as some of the Pauline material are forgeries. Okay? That the Pauline party was not at all adverse to knocking out a few extra epistles in the name of one of their heroes. And the fact that they're epistles, letters, some of them to the same churches that Paul wrote to, to the Ephesians and so on, also fits with the Pauline party's form, if you like. Now, he points out you don't have to agree that they come from 165 to 175, as a couple of the scholars are arguing. It's sufficient to say, yep, you've made a case, these are not authentic documents of Ignatius. As soon as you split the letters of Ignatius from the lifetime of Ignatius, then you've opened a wider window for the Gospel of Matthew. Okay? It might only go to 110, but all you've got to do is say, we can't be sure that the letters of Ignatius are A, genuinely from Ignatius, and B, absolutely do know the Gospel of Matthew, and straight away that begins to broaden. And so Sims is arguing in his article, which I hope you will read if you haven't already read it, that's enough ground for Matthean Gospel scholars to at least entertain the possibility that Matthew was written a decade or two later than traditionally it's dated. And if we do that, everything fits together much better. Okay, and so the date of the Ignatian letters is no longer a barrier to a slightly later date for the Gospel of Matthew. So he's not saying Gospel of Matthew is written in 180. All he's saying is it might have been 110 or 120 rather than 85. Okay. So we don't have to accept the latest dates proposed by some of the studies, but there's a good enough case has been made to suggest that the Gospel of Matthew could be later than the time of Trajan. Okay, which means after 117. Now, I would think it's probably even still within the time of Trajan, but certainly would almost certainly have to be before the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Okay, so somewhere between 100 and 120 becomes a realistic window, rather than between 80 and 100. Okay, and so a later date for Matthew is now an option. The previous point is saying that the material which could be later than the time of Trajan are the letters attributed to Ignatius. And if that's the case, then that allows the dating of Matthew to be put within a larger window rather than a narrow window. Okay? And when that happens, then Matthew fits much better with a realistic timeline for the development of formative Judaism. So it all starts to click together. Now that's not proof, it just means that you're getting a better fit, which is reassuring. Okay? So that brings us then to Matthew and formative Judaism. You need to, if you're interested in this stuff, you need to get into some of the really important articles in the Cambridge History of Judaism. It's, I think, a 4-volume work at the moment. It's in the library, and the earlier couple of volumes are particularly important for the late 1st century, early 2nd century period. In a nutshell, what comes out of this is the whole Council of Jamnia, rabbinic leadership getting together, reinventing Judaism, is a nonsense. It never happened. The sources themselves don't say it happened. It's been a convenient sort of legend for both Jewish and Christian scholars. And that the process of rabbinic leadership emerging and establishing itself and gaining enough authority to issue any rulings which would gain respect in the wider diaspora Jewish community is going to take several decades. It's not going to happen within 15 years of the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, Jamnia is was a small village to the south of what is now Tel Aviv, and the rabbinic leadership very quickly moves up to near Haifa, to Beit Sherim, the tombs and the caves, and then it relocates to Sepphoris and even to Nazareth, and to then finally to the city of Tiberias. Okay, so yes, the rabbinic leadership, but this is a process over several decades, and it culminates with the work of Rabbi Judah the Prince, with the publication of the Mishnah in 200 CE. It's not a case that everything is worked out by a small group of scholars within 15 or 20 years of the destruction of Jerusalem. So it's a longer process. It takes time for this to happen. It takes time for their view of Judaism to become normative, let alone formative. And then so the Matthean community in descent from formative Judaism also needs more time and could not have happened by 85. It's just too early for it all to happen. So what Sim is arguing is that if we allow an extra couple of decades, extra 10, 15, 20 years, it just allows for this process to be more developed, and also explains why there's not so much interest in Matthew in actually the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew's gospel does not appear to be coming out of the trauma of the destruction of Jerusalem. It knows about it, but it's not a hot political issue for them. So a longer time of transition, as Sim says on page 19, a later date is more consistent with the evidence of the conflict between the Matthean community and formative Judaism. So that leads him and others to say, well, it's either got to be somewhere around Antioch or somewhere in the Galilee. Galilee seems unlikely, and especially unlikely for an earlier date for Matthew rather than a later date. Antioch seems stronger, and in particular is a much stronger explanation that hangs together better if you allow an extra decade or two to go by. People that argue for a Galilean context usually suggest either Sepphoris or Tiberias as the context, and yet neither of those cities is mentioned in Matthew. It'd be most remarkable. I mean, given that Matthew does actually mention Syria, which is unusual, and never mentions Tiberias or Sepphoris, the telltale signs point towards a Syrian location in a very broad sense of Syria, possibly Antioch. The fact that there's so little reference to the Jewish war suggests that the Jewish war is now more of a faded memory, and it also fits in with Antioch, which is, as we saw, a fair way to the north, some distance away from the devastation. Antioch itself, as a significant Hellenistic commercial centre, was known to have a large Jewish community. We know it was a centre for the early Jesus movement, with both people like the James faction and the Paul faction, both having a base in Antioch. Features in the Acts of the Apostles, Ignatius was the third bishop of the city, the first bishop, of course, being Peter, according to tradition. I'm sure he didn't have a business card that said Bishop of Antioch. Okay? But in the tradition, he was the Bishop of Antioch before he became Bishop of Rome. So in many ways, the suggestion is that someone like Ignatius of Antioch represents the Pauline victory over the Matthians in Antioch. Okay? And that suggests that what we have in Matthew is an earlier phase of the Antioch church, or at least a part of the Antioch church, which was more Torah observant, more like James than Paul, if you like. So Matthew represents the high tide of the James tradition within early Christianity, and it's exactly the kind of Christianity which Marcion rejected because of his exaggerated Pauline tendencies. So we start to get a dialogue, a larger matrix forming here. For the Matthians, Torah observance remains important. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. Not one jot or tittle, okay, not one tiny little mark in the Hebrew alphabet will change until everything has been fulfilled. So Torah observance remains important, but Jesus in Matthew is a radical rabbi who actually increases the severity of Torah. Okay? As in those antitheses in Matthew chapter 5. So Matthew could be seen as the final flourish of a version of Christianity which was not destined to survive. And it soon becomes incorporated into the story of the great church, because ultimately the Pauline view of Christianity was going to dominate even in Antioch. Paul was going to win the day. Now just very quickly, the last slide, just putting this up against Hertz, the sort of comments from Lutz in his Hermeneia commentary. He has three basic points, theses that he calls them, towards the end of his introduction. As my first thesis, I therefore maintain the Gospel of Matthew comes from a community founded by the itinerant messengers and prophets of the Son of Man of the Palestinian sayings source. So he's really there invoking the Didache and Q to explain the origins of the Matthean community. And it continues to be in close contact with them. That's locating Matthew within that more Torah observant prophetic tradition of early Christianity. My second thesis is that the Gospel of Matthew originates in a situation in which this Jewish Christian community was at a turning point. Okay? And the turning point for Lutz is that it's all about the Gentiles. Okay? And that the author of Matthew lives and breathes that more conservative Jewish expression of the Jesus movement, but is arguing and championing the idea that Jesus wants us to embrace the Gentiles. Go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe everything that I have commanding, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay, this commissioning, the Great Commission to not to limit the church to the Jewish community. In other words, so within the diversity of Christian expressions within Antioch, the author of Matthew is basically arguing we've got to start embracing the Gentiles because we're being pushed out of the synagogues. The future lies with the mission to the Gentiles. Okay?